Seems like just about everyone has a strong opinion about what's right and wrong with public education in the United States. We hear heated debates everywhere about the purposes of education and competing agendas for how to reform or transform it. On one end of the spectrum is the dominant narrative, a corporate education agenda backed by government policies and wealthy funders that promotes standardized testing and curriculum, school privatization, attacks on ethnic studies, union busting, zero-tolerance discipline policies, and much more that we'll be talking about throughout Flashpoint's education series in the weeks ahead. On the other side of the continuum is growing resistance to these narratives and blossoming movements for anti-oppressive, culturally relevant, and socially just education. But these debates and struggles did not begin in the 21st century with George Bush or his No Child Left Behind policies. In fact, there have been competing paradigms and worldviews since the European colonizers, the slave traders, and the settlers invaded the indigenous peoples of this continent and set up shop on the land that we now call North America. Today we'll look more closely at these competing paradigms and their impacts both historically and currently. To help us do that, we're excited and we're honored to be joined by Rose von Braan. She is co-founder and director of the Native American Academy, which uses research, dialogue, writing, and action projects to make the Native paradigm, indigenous learning processes, and Native science visible to the Western world. She was formerly the director of education at UC Berkeley's Center for Particle Astrophysics. Rose, welcome to Flashpoints, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Let me start by asking you what's important for us to know about who you are personally and a little more about the work that you've been doing in education.
I don't think there's very much that's important to know about me personally. I think that probably my work describes me, but I will give you my background as a Native woman. I am Tuscarora. I'm also African, mestiza, and German. So I'm someone that is often called a returnee. That's a Native person who was born far from their tribal lands and who has, through the strength of our relationship, been drawn back to their own culture and heritage.
Mm-hmm. And tell us a little more about the Tuscarora.
The Tuscarora were originally in the southeast part of the country, the eastern band of the Cherokee, those areas. They shared and fought over until the 1700s, right after King Philip's War, when they moved north and were taken in as part of the Iroquois Confederacy, and they became the sixth nation, the Little Brother.
Okay. When dominant culture talks about the history of public education in the United States, the conversation usually begins with the schools that the European settlers and the colonizers set up, and then the schools of their descendants. Take us on a more honest historical journey. How did the indigenous cultures who were here before those colonizers came think about the concept of education?
I think that the easiest and most direct pathway into that question is to understand that the very heart of indigenous learning is relationship, and it's relationship to place. So that, for instance, if you were to speak about Native science, which isn't really an accurate term because we wouldn't separate science from art or from housekeeping. Mm-hmm. Education in the Native way, in the indigenous world, is not bounded by a structure or limited by only people that are anointed to teach you within a certain time frame. We learn through relationship, through dream, through ceremony, through song. We learn in community. We learn intergenerationally. But it all really comes down specifically to relationship to place. and an understanding, and a more accurate, I believe, understanding of our place in the whole of things. In the indigenous world, human beings are not seen as greater than or lesser than. They are just equal to every other form of life. That is a very radical shift for most Western thinkers. So that means that we don't stand on the earth and look out. We are a part of it and are observing what is around us and what is within us. We belong to the earth. It does not belong to us.
That's a very different paradigm than, first of all, I mean, in many ways, but first of all, it's a different way of thinking of subjects. So it's not there's history here and there's math here. It's also very different in terms of where the knowledge sits, right? It's not sitting in an expert teacher who knows all, and then there's these passive students who are just having information poured into their heads.
No, that's an important point, because our elders tell us that we enter carrying knowledge, and we enter with a learning spirit. That's distinct from the spirit of learning, which would be an English concept. We enter with a learning spirit, and we don't know a lot about it. We do know that you enter with a particular learning spirit, and they seem to evolve over cycles, so that by the time you're my age, which is in my 70s, I've probably got, 7 or 8 of them who have been with me throughout my evolution. And your learning spirit then acts like a form of gravity that attracts you to those things that will allow you to make your own unique expression and contribution. And the task of your family and your community and those that you go to for maybe specific learnings is to guide you and to ease and open that pathway for your expression. So it's a very different concept than, force feeding.
Right.
And for Native students, even those who have never seen their tribal lands, who may not speak their own language, who have been brought up in a totally urban situation, they still have the indigenous worldview. They perceive the world in a particular way, so that the Western education system is really quite often a very serious assault on their learning spirits.
I actually, I want to pick up on that in 1 minute. I'm going to come back to that question about the Western educational system as a sort of colonizing force. I just want to follow up first. When we were talking about sort of the arrival of Eurocentric schools, prior to the arrival of the Europeans, was the form of education within indigenous cultures in an institutional setting like a school, or was it all through ceremony, song, stories?
Dream relationships. So, for instance, an uncle would be responsible for certain teachings rather than a father or a grandmother, and so forth, so that it in every aspect it reflects wholeness and relationship.
Okay. Let's go to that question about the ways that Eurocentric education actually became an instrument of colonization historically. So, for example, in 1864, Congress passed a law that made it illegal for Native Americans to be taught in their own language. And then Native children were taken from their parents and sent to boarding schools that were run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Can you talk more about some of that history, about how schooling actually was used as a weapon?
It's extremely painful.
Yes.
Because you have to realize that 1864 is really pretty far along, and we had already been through genocide. Yeah. We had what is not taught in the Western education system is that there was a fully functioning, vibrant, rich culture and knowledge flourishing on these lands when they arrived. Because of their cultural lens and their inability to perceive it, they then, through, germs, guns, and steel, were able to develop, and out of that development came a hegemonic education system. Now, when they began, there's been assault after assault to attempt to break down the sovereignty, and obviously the treaties have been broken many times, but to really break apart the culture, to force assimilation, it cannot be done, and it hasn't been done, and ultimately it will not be done. I can't explain it, I don't think, in English or even in words. But the strength of being, of who and what a being is, we've seen it demonstrated not only among Native people, but among many other cultures. So I've wandered somewhat from your question. I don't.
No, you went exactly to the heart of my question. Absolutely.
Ken, could I say one other
Sure,
thing about
absolutely.
that? Because I think it's important. The boarding school experience, you'll hear a lot. There are people that, Native people that will say, I got a lot out of it. They're relatively few, I think. But probably might be of interest to you in this exploration is that not that long ago in Canada, one of the members of the Academy, who is the head of the Native Law Center, developed an overall strategy and put together first a study to uncover and articulate the damage and trauma resulting from loss of culture and abuse in the boarding schools that were run by the government and by the churches, the Anglican Church and others in Canada. Ultimately, after many years, that suit was successful. And I think the settlement was a big settlement. It was lots and lots and lots of money, which when you spread it all out doesn't mean much. But more to the point was that the Canadian Prime Minister, I believe it was the Prime Minister, on the floor of Parliament, made a public apology.
Wow.
That hasn't happened in the United States. And I think that one of the things that is so difficult for the United States to come to grips with is the truth of our history. We all want to be proud of this country. But for this country to actually live up to its principles, you can't do it. It can't be done.
Right.
You've got to uncover and let the wound be seen, recognized, and healed.
Absolutely. Very well said. Enormous denial in this country, and the gap, the gap between what is stated and what is real is
Well, it limits the education of our children,
Right.
not native children,
Right.
children. And it limits their ability to be able to function in a world that is outrageously diverse because they're being educated in one worldview and told that nothing other than that is valid.
Right. I want to go a little deeper into that question, actually, and make that link between historically the role of colonizing education and now what's actually happening through the current system. So let's start actually with Indigenous children, and I totally hear you that this is not just an issue for Indigenous children, it's about all children. But let's specifically start with Indigenous children today. Can you paint a picture of where Indigenous children are being educated institutionally? Like what percentage are on reservations versus in urban areas? I don't know if you know that, or just generally what the impact been of the educational institutions on Indigenous children these days.
I think the dropout rate is something like 77%.
Wow. Wow.
Which is only slightly less terrifying than what follows that, which is the suicide rate.
Mm.
The issue is that when our children go to school, there is no reflection. It's been stated beautifully by Marie Baptiste. It's like looking into the mirror, and the mirror looks away. Mm. And so there's no way, or there's no forum, there is no way that a child who perceives through their full body of senses, who learns through relationship with whatever is around them, can share their thinking, can share their, I was taking a painting class, and I was stunned until I finally came to a native painter, a Latina woman, magnificent muralist here in Berkeley, and began studying with her because all of everything that was taught about the Europeans. So there was nothing, I had to go and dig. Well, okay. I mean, I'm sure you can say that about a lot of things. But when you have a 6-year-old going to school and there's no reflection of them in that school of what they know for them, in what they know inherently, what they may have learned from their grandparents, they are then just watch how that, builds until in their teen years, the results are pretty terrifying. Mm-hmm. They're brutal.
Right. What does it look like on the reservations or on schools that are run by sovereign nations?
I don't want to set myself up as an expert.
Okay.
I've not been to school on the res,
Okay.
and I know that those schools, the teachers there are committed and loving people. But if you have an image that they're all native teachers who are native speakers who have all been brought up in a traditional way, that's not so.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Fair enough. You have done a lot of work, and Native Academy has done a lot of work trying to bridge Indigenous and Western paradigms. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that work and how you see some possibilities of starting to bridge some of those paradigms within public education?
Well, as you said, the work of the Native American Academy, first of all, let me explain that when we use the word academy, we're referring to all the people because our knowledge is held collectively. The founding circle of what we call the Native American Academy are a group of indigenous scholars and traditional knowledge holders who, in their own careers and personal lives and professional lives, have focused on making the indigenous worldview visible to the Western-trained mind in a variety of forums, both regional, national, international. So what does that look like? That's, those are just a lot of English words. Mm-hmm. What does that look like? I, after a lifetime in the arts, found myself at the University of California at Berkeley at the Center for Particle Astrophysics, which was at that time one of the first generation of science and technology centers. It was founded by NSF. And as part of their block grant, they had a grant, an 11-year grant, which is an amazing thing to have. And the science was magnificent. I mean, so far, 2 Nobel Prize winners have come out of that 11 years of work. Wow. But there was an education component in the grant that had to be fulfilled. And quite often, those are pretty boilerplate programs. However, I was working with a very, not only an intelligent, but a very open-hearted man. His name is Bernard Sadoulet, who is, he was the director at that time. And when I suggested to him that we needed to actually address the line in the grant that said that we would increase diversity, and that in order to do that, that meant that we needed to generate a culture in science that allowed not for just diversity of color, but for diversity of thought, and that the culture of science itself, now I'm speaking primarily of the world of astrophysics and physics and astronomy, not even so much astronomy, but physics itself can be, of course, quite isolated. So that we really needed to look at that culture because it was not serving the non-native students that were there, that the model for success did not match not even the 20th century, much less the coming 21st century. And so with his agreement and support, we began a program that was called The Changing Culture in Science. And in that program, because I was the director of education and outreach, I formed it around indigenous principles of communication, and really had to say, look, I know you guys are the smartest guys in the world. However, this is where it is. You're in a technical sense, you can communicate anything, but that's not good enough. Mm-hmm. Your model of success denies people a life and denies women to be present. Even the numbers of women at that time were quite small, and I don't know that they've grown that much. Men, young men who want to be present fathers, who actually are interested in teaching as well as research. Mm-hmm. There are all of these elements, but rather than framing it as, this is what's wrong with you, we framed it as these are aspects of a community, and that in order for science itself to remain healthy and vibrant, we need to look at what it means to generate and sustain a culture that honors and respects and values and is enriched by diversity. Mm. So that was the beginning, at least for me, of my work. And in the meanwhile, my colleagues up in Canada and in other parts of the country were also working on different aspects. Leroy Littlebear, who I believe you've spoken with, loves science, loves it. And so he had met with David Bohm, who was a quantum physicist, a prime contributor, and had what may have been one of the first serious conversations between a Western scientist and a native quote scientist. And out of that conversation grew a series of indigenous ceremonial dialogues that we called the Science Dialogues. And in those dialogues, which were conducted ceremonially, we invited Western scientists to come and sit with us. And we held them all over. We held them in Banff. We held them in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. We've held them in Connecticut. We've held them at various parts of North America. And it has led to, this really came about, because being at Berkeley and being among the astrophysics community, the relationship between the National Science Foundation was close and opening. It was opening up so that our education program was innovative. It spoke to many things that NSF was interested in, such as the small number of women, the inequity of women. Their mandate is to build a scientific community that reflects the diversity of the country. So they were very supportive. And really from that, once we began inviting them to these dialogues. And out of that grew the Native American Academy. So we've moved, from speaking, exploring just the boundaries of the two worldviews on science, to really moving to the deeper foundations, which is about learning and how we learn and how the two cultures and the two worldviews, what are the ways in which we learn? Because Native people have been speaking for 500 plus years, and it wasn't until about 4 or 5 years ago that I realized, wait a minute, we have to teach them how to listen, where to listen from when we speak. Because, as should be expected, we're speaking in English, which is a second language. And we're speaking into a consciousness that values the intellect beyond anything. And in the indigenous worldview, the intellect has a place, a useful place, but it is not the arbiter. It is too narrow a channel for the level of interdependency and complementarities, for the level of thought that you must have if you are concerned with the harmony and balance of the whole. So we began to convene what we call learning lodges. And these learning lodges were and are held according to traditional, they follow the traditional values and principles, the philosophy of the native paradigm. It's simple stuff, I want to be clear. The Learning Lodge is a dynamic. It's a process. the content, the talks, the writings, the stories, they all provide handholds for discovery and for learning. But it's by animating and embodying the way that we learn as Native people that actually opens the possibility for the Western trained mind to comprehend the reality of the indigenous worldview. So in those lodges, we're offering a portal not so much to what we know, but how we come to know it. Because by understanding that, by reawakening the Western, in the Western trained mind, by reawakening the senses, not just the five conventional, but the entire body as an organ for sensing, and the deeper senses, the metaphorical, what might be called in English metaphorical, that sense of honor, the sense of justice, the sense of belonging, that is all a part of the learning. None of it cannot be separated. So these seem like impossible. You know, you've got Western thought which fragments and studies something in a very narrow frame and very deeply, and then you have the indigenous worldview which concerns itself with the whole and its balance and its harmony and its relationship. So our work is about bringing those two worldviews into a mutually beneficial, ethical relationship out of which can emerge the knowledge that we need now, because, first of all, because it's the knowledge that's needed in order for us to be able to hold a space in which the transformation that we need can occur. We cannot engineer environmental changes. They are beyond human capacity. However, we can indeed open a space where we are able and consciously practicing holding divergent views as valid and equal to our own. And out of that, not only can new knowledge emerge, but the act of doing that opens a space in which transformation itself can occur.
Wow. So there's so much you said there. You know, one thing I'm thinking about is that there's a movement among some educators for what people might call social justice education, although people mean enormously different things by that. People who consider themselves social justice educators are thinking about both sides of what you talked about. It's content, but also the ways that people learn. What happens for a lot of social justice educators is that we try to think of a different way to do it, but we're kind of bound by our own paradigms and our own limited experiences. So it's hard to actually think outside the box. You're breaking some of those restrictions.
There is no box.
There is no box. Exactly. So, I mean, what you're describing happened through scientists and professionals and adults. Has anyone tried to apply these techniques in a K-12 setting?
It's much easier.
Okay. All right.
Ken, let me back up. I
Sure.
want to say
Sure.
one of the things that happens when you say social justice, kind of those two words, the framework, is a binary framework, my way or your way. It's immediately, it's adversarial in timbre. And so the doorway out of that is to recognize that binary thought is the problem. You know, it's not that you can't think in binary terms, but that by only thinking in binary terms, you've locked the door. You can't, it holds everything in place.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to make that
So
one
that's
statement.
not terminology you would normally...
Social justice?
Yeah.
It's too political for me.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
I don't deny that I mean, education has been used as a political tool
Mm-hmm.
and is used as a political tool.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I have no interest in,
Mm-hmm.
in that context.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking more about creating a space for divergent views, for example, as opposed to
I believe that until we really teach our children that's not just a possibility, but it's a truth. That is what there is. If you look out the window, if you look out the window, there is not just one or two kinds of trees or dirt or rocks or anything else. There is diversity beyond our capacity to understand, and it functions when left to itself or when worked with in complement beautifully.
Mm-hmm.
That's the model.
Mm-hmm.
It's right there in front of our very eyes. It's not my limited human intellectual construct.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to that question about what that approach would look like in a K-12 classroom for kids, let's say, between 5 and 18. Because, again, part of why I think this is important is those of us who came through Eurocentric dominant institutions, we just have this poverty of imagination. Even if we want to do it differently, it's very hard to kind of break that.
It is very hard. This is called transcultural learning, and it's rigorous.
Mm-hmm.
The scientists that I spoke about were, they were enervated, furious, irritated, profoundly moved, all of it.
Mm-hmm.
It was very much for them what it's like for our children when we go to school.
Mm.
So, to answer your questions, I did I was invited to the Des Moines Unified School District.
Mm.
I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly what it was, but they asked me if I would come and do a 2 or 3 day leadership piece for their seniors. And I did. And I remember I walked in, and one of the first things, was I said, look, you need to put all the chairs in a circle. If you can't get them in one circle, put them in 3 circles. It doesn't matter. The next thing was when the students came, I said, look, we're going to be here for a while. If you're tired, go to sleep. What I'm going to say, if you need to know it, you'll hear it. You'll hear it whether you're awake or asleep.
Mm.
These students were so stressed. They were exhausted. You could see them. You could see them walking in. This was their last year. And they'd been through almost like they'd been through the industrial conveyor line and the responsibility of selecting a college and making sure that they made enough money and what were they going to do and were they socially acceptable. And it was, had nothing to do with their education.
Right.
What we did, they were very simple things. I spoke about leadership in indigenous and native terms, that our leaders are not, one thing or another. Our leaders are painters and scientists. Our leaders know that their duty is to protect and care for and serve the children, the old people, the land. It's not about those words, because I think that those words apply to non-native people. Mm. We're not the only people that know this. It's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. But I'm talking about the pragmatics of being willing to embody it, of being willing to say, this is how much I need. So this is how much I will take. It's not about being seduced by the general consciousness of, certain. I love beautiful things. I'm not exempt. But to really actually stop and consider, what is it that you need? I spoke to those students about their values. What had they made their own moral compass? Did they know what their principles were? Did they know what was negotiable and what was non-negotiable? Did they understand that that was how they were going to have to make their choices with regard to work and life and everything? Did they understand what it actually meant to be in relationship with the place that they were in? And so we went through different processes of identifying places that were meaningful. We sent them out for 2 hours. They couldn't speak for 2 hours to anyone about anything. And, it was just the process itself is very simple. It really is. And very demanding.
Right.
You need to be, what is it? You have to show up. We're doing learning lodges at San Francisco State. I work with one of our most talented young leaders, Melissa Nelson, who is an assistant professor there in Native Studies. And so she does a setup, a native introduction to Native science. And then we shift it into a learning lodge. And in that lodge, we set them up so that they understand that there's no pressure to display or defend their knowledge. Instead, the value is placed on having a still mind and your capacity for listening and the capacity for holding divergent views, and to realize that we're on a learning spiral, and the spiral itself is of value because it's by traveling that spiral you can see the different perspectives, and all those perspectives contribute to your learning so that you now are capable of making choices that serve more than just your own selfish interests.
Wow. Well, somehow that does not fit within the high-stakes testing regime.
There are people that are working. There are. There are some very, very good people that are working.
Yeah. All right. If you had it in your power to just change a couple of things that would make the biggest difference in the public education system in the U.S. I mean, you've addressed a lot of this already, but I'm wondering if there are one or two things, maybe even one or two places to start.
It's the simplest one of all, that we are a part of the whole, that we belong here. It does not belong to us. We belong to it. And that relationship, I would then teach from that relationship. If knowledge is your friend, then how do you treat it? Don't you offer it a drink of water or a comfortable place to sit, or, make certain that it has warmth when it needs it and water when it needs it? And how do you treat your friend? The second thing is that I would say this one thing: if you can start at the very beginning to teach the truth about the capacity, how important it is that we must be able to hold divergent views as valid and equal to one's own, and that all life is. I wouldn't ask them to teach that all life is sentient, because that would infringe on other people's beliefs, but that all life is sacred. The thinking and the teaching is all human-centric. And as you can see, that's gotten us to a pretty scary place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've asked this question of every person that I have interviewed for this series, so I want to ask you the same question. What makes you most concerned about the future of public education, and what gives you the most hope?
The young people themselves give me the most hope, obviously. They are the point, they are the emergence. And they're much smarter than anyone gives them credit for. What bothers me, what makes me crazy, what makes me crazy is the assault on their learning spirits. You know, I have a almost 3-year-old grandson, and I'm working day and night to be certain that when he receives a true, authentic education, not one, not the other, a whole education, because he's a whole being.
All right. Anything else that you want to address that we haven't covered today?
I want to tell you about the next step.
Sure, please do.
Our next step, I was talking about the learning lodges. We're now engaged in a multidimensional endeavor. I can't call it a project because it's a living entity, but we're engaged in the creation of an archive, a library of indigenous knowledge of Turtle Island. And its form will be as a sculptural carving. It's envisioned to be 60 to 70 feet. So that's 6 or 7 stories.
Wow.
And its form is in the form of what, if you only look at it from a Western perspective, you would think it was only art. Only art. However, it's a healing pole. And it's a learning pole. And it is a pole that is, its purpose is to, because this continent has such enormous impact on the rest of the world, the healing of this continent is very important. And I think that it's not a mistake that this continent has lived through genocide and that has made the mistakes that we've made and created the disasters we've created. You know, in a much larger view, it is a very potent learning journey. And there is no way to predict. Our elders and our knowledge holders tell us that they're scared and that we should be scared. However, you know, this learning pole, its first teaching is about the ethical space of engagement. What that is, what it feels like, how to be aware of it, how to sustain it, how to repair it, how to hold it. And again, you know, there's a process that we will follow. The pole will be carved in 4 locations and then assembled. It will be we don't know, we can't yet know where its home site will be.
Mhm.
Several places have been mentioned. One significant place, of course, would be at the capital of this country, in Washington, D.C. It's going to take us about 3 years. We'll start the work in summer of 2015, the actual carving. It'll be done by a team of international carvers, but primarily it will be the knowledge of North America. So the primary carving will be done has to be done. The knowledge emerges through the carvers into the forms. So the capacity to actually gain knowledge from the pole rests with your ability to come back to your senses, to recognize that it is the quality of your consciousness that dictates the depth and breadth of your education, and how well you are able to live and conduct yourself within an ethical space of engagement will dictate what you learn and how deep you can go.
That's a great challenge for all of us. Our guest has been Rose von Braan, co-founder and director of the Native American Academy and former director of education at UC Berkeley Center for Particle Astrophysics. Rose, thank you for sharing your incredible wealth of insight, wisdom, and inspiration with us today.
It's been a great pleasure, and I thank you for allowing me.